A woman sits alone at a kitchen table in a modest but clean home. She is in her mid-40s, still beautiful despite the exhaustion written across her face. Her hands tremble slightly as she holds a single sheet of paper. Her eyes are not crying. They are past crying. They are somewhere beyond tears. In that hollow place grief goes when it has nowhere left to travel. She sets the paper down on the table and stares at it. It is a last will and testament. And there, at the very bottom of the document, in the primary beneficiary line, is a name. Her name. Not the name of the woman her husband left her for. Not the name of the woman he married 6 months after their divorce was finalized. Her name. The name of the woman he threw away. He told her she was not enough. He told her she was ordinary. He traded 23 years of marriage for a woman with a yacht, a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, and a social media following of 4 million people. He walked out of their home, their life, and their history without looking back. And 6 months later, he married the woman the magazines called the most glamorous heiress in New York. But when that woman died, she left behind a secret so enormous, so carefully hidden, so deliberately placed, that it would unravel everything everyone thought they knew about money, loyalty, and the truth about who really loved whom. Because the woman with all the money, the woman with the yacht and the penthouse and the diamonds, left every single dollar she owned to the wife her husband had abandoned. And nobody could explain why. Nobody except the woman sitting at that kitchen table. Because she knew exactly why. And when she finally told the world the truth, nothing would ever be the same again. The visuals shift rapidly now. A lavish Manhattan penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. A humble home in suburban Connecticut with a garden and a yellow kitchen. A courtroom packed with reporters and lawyers. A grave with fresh flowers. Lawyers in expensive suits arguing over documents spread across a mahogany table. A photograph of 2 women together, smiling, arms around each other, standing in front of a cafe that nobody famous would ever visit. The photograph lingers just long enough for the question to form. Who are these 2 women? Why are they smiling like that? And why does nobody seem to know they knew each other? 3 questions hang in the air now, each one heavier than the last. Why would a billionaire socialite leave her entire fortune to the ex-wife of the man she married? Did the husband know about the secret connection between the 2 women in his life? And was the divorce that destroyed one woman's life actually the greatest act of love anyone had ever shown her? These questions do not have simple answers. But by the time this story is finished, every single one of them will be answered. And the answers will change the way you think about betrayal, sacrifice, and the kind of love that never announces itself. Before we go deeper into this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Margaret Collins. Born in 1971 in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Meadville, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and ambition was something you kept quiet about because it made the neighbors uncomfortable. Margaret was the daughter of a high school English teacher named Eleanor Walsh and a man named Robert Walsh who worked 30 years in a steel mill and retired with bad lungs and a modest pension. The Walsh family lived in a 2-bedroom house on Chestnut Street with a front porch that needed painting and a backyard where Eleanor grew tomatoes every summer. Margaret's childhood was not unhappy. It was simply small. The kind of small that teaches you early that dreams are expensive and security is built one paycheck at a time. Eleanor Walsh taught English at the local high school and brought home student essays to grade at the kitchen table while Margaret did her homework beside her. Robert worked the night shift at the mill and slept during the day, and the house learned to be quiet between the hours of 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. Margaret learned early that her father's sleep was sacred, that the bills came first, and that college was something other people's children did unless you were very smart and very lucky and willing to work harder than anyone thought you could. Margaret was all 3. She graduated valedictorian from Meadville Area High School in 1989 with a full scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh. Her mother cried at graduation. Her father shook her hand and told her he was proud. It was the most emotion Margaret ever saw from him. She met Thomas Collins in the fall of 1991 during her junior year. He was a senior studying business administration with a concentration in real estate finance. Margaret was studying elementary education because she loved children and because teaching was a profession that made sense for a girl from Meadville who understood that stability mattered more than dreams. Thomas Collins was not from Meadville. He was from the suburbs of Philadelphia, from a family with 2 cars and a house with 4 bedrooms and parents who had both gone to college and expected their children to do the same. He was handsome in the way that young men with big dreams are always handsome, lit from within by ambition and possibility. He wore button-down shirts even to casual events. He talked about the future the way other people talked about the weather, as though it were something he could see clearly and control completely. Margaret fell for him completely and without reservation. Their courtship was the kind that happens in college when everything feels both urgent and infinite. Late-night conversations in the
This is
library,
way more fun with
walks
you.
through
I
Skinley
was
Park
just
in
thinking
October
that.
when the leaves
We make a
turned
good
gold.
team.
Study
best.
sessions that turned into dinners that turned into staying up until 3 in the morning talking about everything and nothing. Thomas talked about building something, about real estate development and commercial properties and the expansion happening in second-tier cities across the Rust Belt. Margaret talked about her 3rd graders at her student teaching placement and how one of them had finally learned to read after months of struggle. They were different, but the difference felt complementary. He was the dreamer. She was the foundation. And when he asked her to marry him in April of 1993, 6 months after his graduation and 2 months before hers, Margaret said yes, without hesitation. They married in June of 1993 in a small ceremony at St. Bridget's Catholic Church in Meadville. Eleanor Walsh had saved for 2 years to help pay for the wedding. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress from 1968, altered by a seamstress in town to fit Margaret's smaller frame. The dress was simple, cream-colored lace with long sleeves and a high neck. Margaret felt beautiful in it. Thomas wore a rented tuxedo and cried when he saw her walking down the aisle on her father's arm. The reception was held in the church basement with food prepared by the ladies' auxiliary and a DJ who played Motown and classic rock. They danced to Etta James. Thomas held her close and whispered that he was going to build them a life better than anything either of them had grown up with. Margaret believed him. The early years were not easy, but they were happy in the way that young couples building something together are happy. Thomas took a job with a commercial real estate firm in Stamford, Connecticut. Margaret got a position teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school in Norwalk. They rented a small apartment with thin walls and a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people. They ate pasta 4 nights a week because it was cheap. They saved every dollar they could. Thomas worked 60-hour weeks and came home exhausted but energized, always talking about the next deal, the next property, the opportunity he saw that nobody else could see yet. Margaret taught her students and graded papers at night, and on weekends planned lessons that she hoped would make a difference in at least one child's life. Their son Daniel was born in 1995. Their daughter Sophie was born in 1998. By then, Thomas had left the firm and started his own company, Collins Commercial Properties. The business started small: office buildings in second-tier markets, strip malls in suburban areas that were growing faster than anyone expected. Thomas had a gift for seeing potential where others saw risk. And slowly, year by year, the business grew. By 2005, they had bought their first house, a 4-bedroom colonial in a good school district in Darien, Connecticut. By 2010, Daniel was in high school, and Sophie was in middle school, and Thomas Collins was no longer the young man hustling to make his first deal. He was successful, respected, invited to speak on panels about commercial real estate investment, the kind of man who got recognized at charity events and whose opinion mattered in rooms where decisions got made. And through all of it, for 23 years, Margaret Collins was the engine that powered everything. She taught 3rd grade at Royal Elementary School in Darien for 17 years and poured herself into those children the way only someone who genuinely loves teaching can. She knew every student's name. She knew which ones came from homes where food was scarce and which ones needed extra attention because their parents were going through a divorce. She stayed late to tutor struggling readers. She bought supplies with her own money when the school budget ran out. She raised their 2 children with the same attention she gave her students. She managed the household, the finances, the holidays, the doctor's appointments, and the 1,000 invisible tasks that hold a family together while the world only ever sees the surface. She packed Thomas's lunches every morning for 15 years until he told her he preferred to eat out with clients. She planned birthday parties and teacher conferences and family vacations. She was the one who remembered that Daniel needed new cleats for soccer and that Sophie had a piano recital on Thursday. She was the one who sat up with them when they were sick, who helped with homework, who listened when they needed to talk. She did all of this while teaching full-time and managing a home and being the kind of wife who showed up at Thomas's business events with a smile and made small talk with clients and never once complained about the late nights or the business trips or the slowly growing distance between them. Because that distance did grow. Slowly at first. So slowly that Margaret convinced herself she was imagining it. Thomas worked later. Traveled more. Stopped asking about her day. Stopped noticing when she got her hair cut. Stopped reaching for her hand when they walked together. Stopped laughing at her jokes. The small intimacies that had defined their marriage for 2 decades began to disappear one by one, like lights going out in a house, where someone is moving through the rooms turning off switches. By 2014, they were living parallel lives in the same home. Polite, functional, empty. And then, in the spring of 2015, Thomas started mentioning a name in conversation. Casually at first. Just a client. A business contact. Someone he had met at a charity gala in Manhattan. Her name was Victoria Harrington. And the way he said that name, even in those early careless mentions, carried something Margaret recognized immediately. She had heard that tone before. A long time ago. He had used it when talking about her. Margaret asked him once, casually, over dinner, what Victoria Harrington was like. Thomas paused with his fork halfway to his mouth and said she was impressive, smart, committed to her charitable work. Then he changed the subject. But Margaret had seen it. The pause. The way his face changed when he said the name. The small tell that gave away everything. Victoria Harrington was everything the magazines said she was. 41 years old, never married, heir to the Harrington pharmaceutical fortune that her grandfather had built and her father had grown into one of the largest private fortunes in the northeastern United States. Edward Harrington Sr. had founded Harrington Pharmaceuticals in 1952 with a single breakthrough drug for blood pressure management. His son, Edward Harrington Jr., had expanded the company into oncology medications and autoimmune treatments. By the time Victoria inherited controlling interest in the family trust at age 35 following her father's death, the Harrington fortune was estimated at somewhere north of $3 billion. Victoria herself was a fixture in the society pages. She was photographed at the Met Gala, at Art Basel Miami, at political fundraisers for candidates from both parties. She sat on the boards of 4 major charities. She had been named to various 30 under 30 and 40 under 40 lists. Her Instagram account, which was managed by a social media team, showed a life of unimaginable privilege. Private jets, yacht vacations in the Mediterranean, front row seats at Fashion Week, dinners with celebrities and politicians. She was beautiful in the way that very wealthy people are beautiful, with excellent bone structure enhanced by excellent dermatology and excellent personal training and excellent stylists who knew exactly how to dress a woman who could afford anything. She was also, by all accounts from people who knew her personally rather than through photographs, genuinely intelligent, genuinely kind, and genuinely lonely in the way that very wealthy people who have never been loved for who they truly are tend to be lonely. But Margaret did not know that yet. In those early months, Victoria Harrington was simply a name, a threat, a shadow falling across a life Margaret had spent 23 years building. And Margaret, who had taught 3rd grade for 17 years and understood how children behave when they are hiding something, recognized immediately that her husband was hiding something. She just did not know yet what it was or how bad it would be. The separation came in the spring of 2016, on a Thursday evening in April. Margaret remembers the date because it was 2 days before Easter and she had already bought the candy for the baskets she still made for Daniel and Sophie, even though they were both in college now. Thomas came home from work at 7:30, which was early for him. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Pasta with marinara sauce. The same meal she had made hundreds of times. Thomas walked in, set his briefcase on the counter, and asked if they could talk. Margaret turned off the stove. She knew from his tone that whatever was coming was not a conversation about dinner plans. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where she would later sit holding that
Nothing seems to
document with her
work in
name
this
on it,
marriage.
and
I'm
Thomas
done. I
told
don't
her their
belong
marriage
here.
was over.
I know it's hard,
He
but
did
we
not
can't
shout.
give up.
He did not accuse. He simply stated it as though it were a fact that had already been decided somewhere else, and he was merely informing her of the outcome. He said he needed more. He said he had changed. He said Margaret deserved someone who was fully present. He said all the things that people say when they have already made a decision and are looking for language that makes it hurt less. It did not hurt less. Margaret sat very still and listened to every word. She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply listened with the same attention she gave her students when they were trying to explain something difficult. And when he finished, she asked him one question. She asked him if he was in love with someone else. Thomas paused. The pause lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. Then he said no. He was lying. Margaret knew he was lying. Thomas knew she knew. But neither of them said anything else. Thomas stood up, said he would sleep in the guest room, and left the kitchen. Margaret sat at the table for another hour in the dark. Then she went upstairs, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling until morning. The divorce proceedings began in May of 2016. Thomas hired a firm from Manhattan that specialized in high-net-worth divorces. Margaret hired a local attorney named Richard Chun who had handled her will years ago and who was, by his own admission, out of his depth in a case involving the kind of assets Thomas had accumulated. The negotiations lasted 4 months and were some of the most lopsided proceedings Richard Chun said he had ever witnessed. Thomas had spent the months leading up to the separation, and possibly longer, quietly reorganizing his assets in ways that were technically legal but deeply calculated. Properties that had been purchased during the marriage were transferred to holding companies that Thomas had created years earlier, before the marriage, making them technically separate property. Revenue from recent deals was directed through business accounts that predated the marriage. Investments were restructured. Money was moved. By the time the settlement was reached in September of 2016, Margaret walked away with the family home in Darien, valued at $850,000, but with a mortgage of $400,000 still outstanding. She received a monthly spousal support payment of $4,000, which was considerably less than Richard Chun had argued for, but which Thomas's attorneys had successfully portrayed as generous given that Margaret had a teaching salary and pension. She received half of Thomas's retirement accounts as of the date of separation, which was a standard division, but which meant she did not benefit from any of the growth those accounts experienced in the months following the separation. Thomas walked away with his business, which he claimed was worth considerably less than outside evaluations suggested. He walked away with the vacation home in the Berkshires that had been purchased through one of his holding companies. He walked away with investment accounts and properties and the carefully structured wealth of a man who had seen this coming and planned accordingly. Margaret's attorney told her, in his office after the settlement was signed, that she had been screwed. Not illegally, but thoroughly. Thomas Collins had known this divorce was coming long before he sat down at that kitchen table in April, and he had protected himself. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, on a Tuesday evening in late September, Margaret was folding laundry in the living room when her daughter Sophie called. Sophie was a junior at Boston College. She was crying. Margaret asked what was wrong. Sophie said she had been scrolling through Instagram and had seen a photograph that she needed to show her mother, but did not want to show her mother and did not know what to do. Margaret told her to send it. The photograph appeared on Margaret's phone 30 seconds later. It was Thomas, standing beside Victoria Harrington at a gallery opening in Chelsea. His arm was around her waist. She was leaning into him. They were both smiling. The photograph was tagged with a location and a date. The date was 3 days ago. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she called Sophie back and told her it was okay, that she had known, that this was not a surprise. She was lying. It was a surprise. Not that Thomas had moved on, but the speed, the certainty, the public nature of it. 3 weeks after their divorce was finalized, Thomas Collins was already appearing in photographs with one of the wealthiest women in New York. The timeline made it clear. This relationship had not started after the divorce. It had been happening during the marriage, probably for months, possibly longer. Margaret had been right about the tone in his voice when he said Victoria's name. She had just been too late to do anything about it. The photograph went modestly viral in their social circles. Margaret's friends called to offer sympathy. Her sister drove up from Baltimore and stayed for a weekend and mostly just sat with Margaret in the living room, not saying much because there was not much to say. Her son Daniel called from UCLA and asked if she wanted him to come home. Margaret said no. She said she was fine. She was not fine, but she was also not broken. There is a difference. Broken means you cannot function. Not fine means you are functioning, but every single action requires more effort than it used to. Margaret was not fine, but she was not broken, and she had no intention of breaking. 6 months after the divorce, in March of 2017, Thomas Collins and Victoria Harrington were married in a ceremony at the Harrington family estate in the Hamptons. The estate was a 14,000-square-foot mansion on 6 acres with direct beach access. The wedding was covered by Town and Country magazine and made the society pages of the New York Times. The guest list included 2 United States senators, a former governor, several prominent business figures, and enough old money to fill 3 generations of social register. Thomas wore a custom suit from a Seville Row tailor. Victoria wore a gown by a designer whose name Margaret had to Google. The photographs showed a wedding that looked like something from a movie. Perfect weather, perfect setting, perfect couple. Margaret saw the photos because her daughter sent them by accident in a group text, and then spent 20 minutes trying to unsend them and apologizing. Margaret told Sophie it was fine. Then she looked at the photos for a long time. In every photograph, Thomas looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had always believed he deserved to be. He looked like a man who had traded up, who had made a smart business decision, who had moved from a serviceable sedan to a luxury sports car and was very pleased with the upgrade. Margaret closed her phone, made herself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house that used to hold a family, and allowed herself exactly 1 hour of grief. She set a timer, and when the timer went off, she stood up, washed her cup, and began the work of rebuilding. What happened next is where this story takes its first unexpected turn. Because while everyone expected Margaret to fade quietly into the background of her own life, to become one of those women who get lost in the footnotes of their ex-husband's more glamorous second chapter, Margaret Collins did something nobody anticipated. She decided she was not finished yet. At 45 years old, with 2 grown children and a modest divorce settlement, she enrolled in a master's program in educational psychology at the University of Connecticut. She had been thinking about it for years. About going back to school. About getting the credentials to work with students who had learning disabilities or trauma or challenges that a regular classroom teacher was not equipped to handle. She had always put it off. There had always been something more important. The kids. The house. Thomas's career. Now there was nothing more important. So she enrolled. She also started writing. A friend from her book club had suggested she start a blog about her experience, about rebuilding after divorce. Margaret had never thought of herself as a writer, but she sat down one evening and wrote about what it felt like to wake up in a house that used to be full and now was empty. She wrote about folding laundry for 1 instead of 4, about making dinner and realizing halfway through that she was cooking too much food out of habit, about the small ways that loss shows up in daily life. She published it on a free blogging platform, not expecting anyone to read it. Within a week, it had been shared 2,000 times. Women wrote to her. Women who had been left. Women who had been traded in. Women who understood exactly what she was describing. Margaret kept writing. Once a week. Then twice a week. The blog grew. The following grew. She called it Second Chapter. And it became, without her intending it, a quiet gathering place for women who were rebuilding. She adopted a rescue dog in the summer of 2017, a mutt named Franklin who was 7 years old and had been surrendered to the shelter when his previous owner moved into a nursing home. Franklin had gray around his muzzle and a slight limp in his back leg and no interest in being trained to do tricks. He just wanted to sleep on the couch and go for slow walks and be near someone. Margaret understood that. She repainted the kitchen yellow in August because Thomas had always preferred white and said yellow was too cheerful. Margaret decided she liked cheerful. She planted a garden in the backyard with tomatoes and cucumbers and herbs. She had never had time for a garden before. Now she had time. She laughed again. Not the full unguarded laugh she used to have, but a quieter version of it. A laugh that acknowledged what had been lost, but refused to let the loss be the last word. Her children watched this transformation with something like awe. Daniel came home for Christmas that year and told his mother she seemed different, lighter. Margaret asked if that was a good thing. Daniel said he thought it was. Sophie visited more often than she had when Thomas still lived there. She would sit at the kitchen table while Margaret graded papers or prepared lessons, and they would talk about things they had never talked about before, about relationships and choice and what it means to build a life. Sophie told her mother once, during one of these conversations, that she was proud of her. Margaret cried. It was the first time she had cried in front of her daughter since the divorce. But here is what nobody knew. What nobody could have known. Because Margaret never spoke about it publicly, never mentioned it to her children, never referenced it in her blog, never told a single friend. In the autumn of 2017, approximately 18 months after her divorce was finalized and 6 months after Thomas and Victoria's wedding, Margaret received a private message through her personal email address. The email address that was not connected to her blog or her professional accounts. The email address that only a handful of people had. The message came from an address Margaret did not recognize. The subject line was blank. The message itself was brief. It said only this: "My name is Victoria Harrington. I know this is strange and I understand if you do not respond. But I need to speak with you. There is something you deserve to know. And it cannot wait much longer." Margaret stared at that message for 3 days. She opened it, read it, closed it, opened it again. She did not understand what it meant. She did not understand why Victoria Harrington would contact her. She considered not responding, deleting the message, blocking the address. But something stopped her. Curiosity maybe, or the need to understand, or just the strange pull of wanting to know what someone who had taken your husband wanted to say to you. On the 3rd day, Margaret replied. She wrote 3 sentences. "I received your message. I do not understand why you are contacting me, but I am willing to listen." She pressed send before she could change her mind. Victoria's response arrived within 2 hours. And it was not 3 sentences. It was the longest message Margaret had ever received from anyone. Victoria explained, in careful detail, that she had something to tell Margaret that would be difficult to hear and difficult to believe. She explained that she was ill, that she had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that affected her central nervous system, that the diagnosis had come in January of 2015, 14 months before she had met Thomas Collins, that the condition was progressive and that the treatments were buying time but not providing a cure, that her doctors had told her, privately, that she likely had 5 to 7 years, that she had told no one about this outside her immediate medical team and her personal attorney, that Thomas did not know, that no one in her public life knew, and that there was a reason she was telling Margaret now. Victoria wrote that she had followed Margaret's situation from the beginning, that Thomas had been transparent, in his way, about the fact that he was separating from his wife, that Victoria had known, from their very first conversation, that Thomas Collins was not a man in the process of an honest separation from a marriage that had genuinely ended, that she had known, from the way he talked about Margaret, the careful absence of her name, the studied casualness with which he mentioned having a family, that this was a man in the process of trading away something real for something shiny. Victoria wrote that she had grown up around men like Thomas Collins, that her father had been a man like Thomas Collins, that she recognized the type immediately, and that she did not particularly like it. But here was the thing, Victoria explained, the thing that made her proceed with the relationship even as she recognized its fundamental dishonesty. Victoria Harrington was dying. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the remission was unlikely to last. The condition she had was progressive. And Victoria Harrington, who had 4 million Instagram followers and a penthouse on 5th Avenue and a yacht named after her grandmother, had spent her adult life being loved for everything except who she actually was. She had been loved for her money, for her access, for her name and her address, and what proximity to her could do for other people's careers and ambitions. She had never, not once in her adult life, been loved simply, quietly, the way Margaret Collins had described in her blog when she wrote about what 23 years of real partnership feels like when it is gone. Victoria wrote that she had read every single piece Margaret had published, that she had read them the way a person reads something that articulates an ache they have never had words for, and that she had made a decision that was strange and imperfect and would require Margaret's trust to understand. She had decided that if she was going to spend whatever time she had left in a marriage, she would spend it in a marriage that served a purpose. And the purpose she had chosen was this. She would protect Margaret. She would use the marriage to Thomas Collins and the inevitable inheritance it would not provide him because she intended to structure her estate very carefully indeed, to ensure that the woman he had discarded would be provided for in a way that Thomas could never touch, never predict, and never prevent. The message ended with a request. Victoria asked if Margaret would be willing to meet, in person, somewhere private, to discuss what Victoria was proposing. She said she understood if Margaret refused, that this was strange and possibly offensive, and that Margaret had every right to tell her never to contact her again, but that if Margaret was willing, Victoria would explain everything, and that what she was proposing would change Margaret's life in ways that Margaret could not yet imagine. The message ended there. Margaret read it 4 times. Then she sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours staring at nothing. Then she wrote back. She said yes, she would meet. And she asked one question. Why are you telling me this? Why are you marrying my husband if you are ill? Victoria's response came an hour later. It said only this. Because I have spent my whole life being loved for the wrong reasons. And I read what you wrote about being loved for the right ones. And I want to make sure that at least one person gets what they deserve, even if it cannot be me. They met for the first time on a cold Saturday afternoon in November of 2017 at a small cafe in New Haven called the Coffee Exchange. Victoria had chosen the location because it was far enough from Manhattan that neither of them would be recognized, and because it was the kind of place where 2 women having coffee would not attract attention. Margaret arrived first. She parked her car 3 blocks away and walked to the cafe with her coat pulled tight against the wind. She found a corner table in the back, ordered a coffee she did not drink, and watched the door. Victoria Harrington walked in 20 minutes later. Margaret recognized her immediately, even though Victoria looked nothing like her photographs. In photographs, Victoria Harrington looked polished and distant and slightly untouchable, the way very beautiful people who are photographed constantly learn to look, because a camera is not a conversation and they have learned to give it something glossy and surface level to take away. In person, she looked tired and sad and younger than Margaret expected. She wore jeans and a sweater and minimal makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked, Margaret thought, like someone who was very sick, trying very hard not to look sick. Victoria sat down across from Margaret and said, before Margaret could speak, I am so sorry for my part in what happened to you. Margaret had prepared herself for many possible opening lines, but not that one. Not an apology delivered with that much quiet sincerity. Margaret believed her, not because the apology was perfect, but because the woman delivering it looked like someone who had been carrying the weight of it for a long time. They sat in that cafe for 3 hours. Victoria explained everything. Her diagnosis, her prognosis, her decision to proceed with the marriage to Thomas despite knowing it was built on something fundamentally dishonest. Her plan to structure her will in a way that would ensure Thomas never inherited $1 and that Margaret inherited everything. Margaret listened, asked questions, tried to understand. She asked Victoria why. Why go through with a marriage you know is based on a lie? Why not just leave Thomas the money and spare yourself the charade? Victoria's answer was simple. She said that she wanted, in whatever time she had left, to feel like her life had mattered to someone for the right reasons. That she had spent 41 years being useful to people, being photographed and quoted and invited to events because of what her presence could provide for other people's ambitions. She said that reading Margaret's blog had made her realize something. That there were people in the world who built their lives on something real, on partnership and sacrifice and the kind of love that does not announce itself. And that even if she could not have that for herself, she could at least make sure that someone who deserved it was protected. She also said, and Margaret remembered this part very clearly because it was the first moment she understood that Victoria was not just a wealthy woman with a plan, but a genuinely lonely person reaching out for connection. She said that she hoped they could be friends. That the arrangement she was proposing was not just financial. It was also personal. That she wanted to know Margaret, to talk to her, to understand what a real life looked like, because she had never had one. Margaret asked if Thomas knew about the diagnosis. Victoria said no. She said Thomas believed she was healthy, that she had hidden the illness carefully, that by the time symptoms became visible, it would be too late for him to leave and too late for him to inherit. Margaret asked if Victoria loved Thomas. Victoria paused. Then she said no. She said she found him tolerable, that he was handsome and socially competent and useful for the role she needed him to play. But that love was not part of the equation. It never had been. They left the cafe after 3 hours and agreed to meet again. Once a month at first, then every 6 weeks. Always in places where they would not be recognized. Small cafes, parks, a bookstore in Hartford. They talked about everything. Margaret told Victoria about her childhood in Meadville, about her parents, about teaching, about her children, about what it felt like to wake up one day and realize you had spent 23 years building something with someone who had quietly decided you were no longer worth the effort. Victoria told Margaret about growing up as an heiress, about boarding schools and charity galas, and the performance of being a Harrington. About her father, who had loved the idea of her, but not the reality. About the men who had pursued her for her money, and the friends who had stayed close for access. About the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw what you could give them. Their friendship grew. Slowly, carefully, entirely in secret. Victoria continued her marriage to Thomas, playing the role of glamorous society wife with the same professionalism she brought to everything. Thomas had no idea his first wife and his second wife were meeting regularly. He believed Margaret was in Connecticut rebuilding quietly, posing no threat to his new existence. He believed Victoria was exactly what she appeared to be, a wealthy woman who had chosen him, who elevated his status, who made him, by proximity, more important than he had been before. He was wrong on both counts. By 2019, Victoria's condition had progressed. The treatments were still managing the symptoms, but the progression was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. She tired more easily. Her balance was occasionally affected. She had started using a cane on bad days, though she hid this from public view. Margaret knew. Margaret was often the person Victoria called on the days when the symptoms were bad. The days when pretending took more energy than Victoria had. They would meet at Victoria's penthouse, which Thomas rarely visited during the day because he was at his office or meeting with clients, and Margaret would sit with Victoria while she rested. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. The friendship between them had become, by this point, the most genuine relationship Victoria had ever had. And for Margaret, it had become something she had not expected, a kind of understanding, a recognition that the woman who had technically participated in the destruction of her marriage was, in fact, a deeply lonely person who had seen something in Margaret worth protecting. In the summer of 2020, during the pandemic when the world had slowed down and death felt closer for everyone, Victoria asked Margaret a question. She asked if Margaret hated her. Margaret thought about it for a long time before answering. Then she said no. She said she had been angry at first, that she had wanted to hate Victoria, but that she could not hate someone who had been honest about their motives and who had spent years trying to make right something that had been wrong. She said that Victoria had done something strange and imperfect, but that the intention behind it was protection, and that Margaret had come to understand that sometimes love, real love, looks nothing like what we expect it to look like. Victoria cried. It was the first time Margaret had seen her cry. Victoria said that no one had ever looked at her and seen past the money and the name to the person underneath, except Margaret, and that knowing Margaret had been the best accident of her life. By early 2021, Victoria was very ill. The doctors had told her privately that she likely had months, not years. The disease had progressed faster than anyone expected. Victoria updated her will one final time in January of 2021 with the help of her attorney, Catherine Park. The document was ironclad. 3 separate psychiatric evaluations confirmed Victoria's mental competence. Every asset was itemized. Every provision was clear. The primary beneficiary, listed in bold at the top of the document, was Margaret Collins, former wife of Thomas Collins. Everything, the penthouse, the yacht, the investment accounts, the shares in Harrington Pharmaceuticals, the art collection, the jewelry, everything. Thomas Collins was listed as receiving nothing. The document anticipated challenges. It included detailed explanations for why the will was structured as it was. It referenced the correspondence between Victoria and Margaret. It made clear that this was Victoria's choice, made with full knowledge and complete intent. Victoria Harrington died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021. The date was March 16th. Margaret knows because Victoria had called her 3 days earlier to say goodbye.
Please don't leave me.
The call
I
came in
can't
the
bear to
evening.
lose you, not now.
Victoria's voice
Please
was
stay
weak
with me.
but clear. She said that her doctor had told her it would be soon. Days, maybe a week. She said that everything was in place. That Catherine Park had all the documents. That Margaret should not worry about anything. That it was handled. Margaret asked if she could come see her. Victoria said no. She said she did not want Margaret's last memory of her to be in a hospital bed. She said she wanted Margaret to remember the cafe in New Haven. The conversations. The laughter. The friendship. Margaret cried on the phone. Victoria did not. She said that she was not afraid. That she had done what she wanted to do. That she had protected someone worth protecting. And that was enough. They stayed on the phone for 2 hours. Mostly in silence. Just being present with each other. When they finally said goodbye, Victoria said one last thing. She said take care of Franklin. Margaret promised she would. 3 days later, Victoria died in her penthouse. Thomas was in the next room. He had been attentive in the final weeks, holding her hand, bringing her tea, sitting beside her bed. To anyone watching, he looked like a devoted husband. Margaret wondered, in the days after Victoria's death, if Thomas had loved her at all, or if his attentiveness had been the performance of a man who understood that a very large inheritance was approaching and wanted to be positioned favorably when it arrived. She would never know. And in the end, it did not matter, because what happened next made all of it irrelevant. The reading of Victoria's will took place 48 hours after her death in the offices of Park & Associates on Park Avenue. Catherine Park had scheduled it quickly because she knew what was coming and wanted it handled before Thomas had time to prepare. Thomas arrived with 2 attorneys from his divorce firm. He wore a dark suit. His face carried the appropriate expression of grief mixed with composure. He sat down at the conference table, straightened his tie, and prepared to hear his name at the top of a document that would make him one of the wealthiest men in New York. Catherine Park did not waste time on pleasantries. She opened the document and began to read. The first section detailed Victoria's final wishes for her funeral and burial. Thomas listened with half attention. Then Catherine reached the section titled Distribution of Assets, and she read the name in the primary beneficiary line. The name was not Thomas Collins. The name was Margaret Collins, former wife of Thomas Collins, current resident of Darien, Connecticut, sole and primary beneficiary of the entirety of the Victoria Harrington estate valued at approximately $2.3 billion. Thomas Collins sat very still. Catherine Park continued reading. The list of assets, the properties, the investments, the art, the jewelry, the shares in Harrington Pharmaceuticals, all of it left to Margaret Collins. When Catherine finished, there was silence in the room for approximately 30 seconds. Then Thomas spoke. He said there must be a mistake. Catherine Park said there was no mistake. Thomas said he wanted her to read it again. Catherine Park read it again. The name was still Margaret Collins. Thomas stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. He knocked over his water glass. Water spread across the table. He said, his voice rising now, that this was impossible. That Margaret had done something to Victoria. That no one leaves $2 billion to a stranger. That someone had manipulated his wife. That Margaret must have gotten to her somehow. His attorneys tried to calm him. Catherine Park waited. When Thomas finally stopped talking, Catherine said 2 things. First, Margaret Collins was not a stranger to Victoria Harrington. They had been corresponding regularly for nearly 4 years. Second, Victoria had anticipated this exact reaction and had structured the will with 3 independent psychiatric evaluations confirming her complete mental competence. The will was ironclad, and it would stand. Thomas contested the will immediately. His legal team filed challenges based on undue influence, mental incompetence, and fraud. They hired forensic accountants, psychiatric experts, handwriting analysts. They demanded access to all correspondence between Margaret and Victoria. This was their mistake, because in demanding that documentation, in subpoenaing every email and text message and phone record, Thomas's legal team inadvertently assembled the complete picture of what the relationship between Margaret and Victoria had actually been. For years and 7 months of correspondence, emails about books and life and loneliness, text messages about meeting times and favorite coffee shops, phone records showing calls that lasted hours, photographs of the 2 women together at cafes and parks. A friendship, a real friendship built slowly and carefully between 2 people who had both been failed by Thomas Collins in different ways. The court received all of it. The judge, a woman named Elena Martinez who had spent 30 years on the bench, read all of it. Every email, every message. And when she issued her ruling 11 months after Victoria's death, in February of 2022, she did not simply uphold the will. She wrote an opinion, a 12-page document that detailed why the will would stand and why the challenges had failed. The opinion noted that the correspondence showed no evidence of manipulation, that Victoria's language was clear and intelligent throughout, that the psychiatric evaluations were thorough and unimpeachable, and that the relationship between Victoria Harrington and Margaret Collins appeared, from all available evidence, to be a genuine friendship between 2 women who had recognized something valuable in each other. The opinion ended with a paragraph that Catherine Park later told Margaret she had never seen in a will dispute. Judge Martinez wrote that the law existed to honor the wishes of the deceased, not to protect the expectations of the living. That Thomas Collins had expected to inherit his wife's fortune. But expectation was not entitlement. And Victoria Harrington had been extraordinarily clear about who she wanted to inherit her estate. The will stood, every word of it. Margaret Collins inherited $2.3 billion. She received notification of the ruling by phone while she was at the grocery store buying food for Franklin. She pulled over into a parking lot and sat in her car for 20 minutes trying
really?
to
That's
process what
incredible.
Catherine Park was telling her. Then she drove home, fed the dog, made herself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table in the house she had kept after the divorce. The house with the yellow kitchen. The house where she had taught herself to be alone. And she looked at the document Catherine had emailed her. The will, with her name at the top. And she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in 6 years. She allowed herself to feel seen. Thomas Collins spent the next 14 months in a state of barely controlled rage. He appealed the decision. The appeal was denied. He appealed again to a higher court. That appeal was also denied. His legal fees approached $4 million. He had spent that money pursuing an inheritance he would never receive. His business, which had always relied on connections and relationships, began to suffer. People in their social circle, people who had congratulated him on his marriage to Victoria, quietly distanced themselves. Not because they disliked him, but because the narrative around Thomas Collins had shifted. He was no longer the successful businessman who had married well. He was the man who had left his wife of 23 years, married a billionaire, and been cut out of her will in favor of the woman he had left behind. The story was too good, too perfectly ironic. And Thomas Collins became, in the circles where reputation mattered, a cautionary tale. He sold Collins' commercial properties in late 2022 for considerably less than it was worth because he needed cash to cover legal fees and because buyers knew he was desperate. He moved out of the Hamptons estate that had belonged to Victoria. The estate now belonged to Margaret, who donated it to a foundation that ran programs for at-risk youth. Margaret kept the penthouse in Manhattan only long enough to have Victoria's personal items cataloged and donated to the charities Victoria had supported. Then she sold it. She did not need a penthouse. She needed a life that made sense. Thomas moved to a condominium in Naples, Florida. He lives there now. He is, by all reports, comfortable. He has enough money to live well. But he is not wealthy. He is not the man he planned to be when he sat across from Margaret at that kitchen table in 2016 and told her he needed more. Margaret Collins used the inheritance in ways that reflected exactly who she had been her entire life. She established the Victoria Harrington Foundation in the summer of 2022 with an initial contribution of $50 million. The foundation focuses on autoimmune disease research, with a particular emphasis on the condition Victoria had. She funded scholarships
Congratulations
at the
on your
University
hard
of
work and
Pittsburgh for
perseverance.
first-generation college
Thank you.
students
This means
from
so
working-class
much.
You earned
families.
it.
She made an anonymous donation of $10 million to Royal Elementary School in Darien to fund arts and enrichment programs for the next 20 years. She kept the house in Connecticut, the yellow kitchen, the garden. Franklin the dog, who is now 11 years old and sleeps on the left side of her bed, which was always Thomas's side. She continued teaching for 2 more years after the inheritance. Her principal asked her why. "You are a billionaire," he said. "You could do anything." Margaret said she liked teaching, that the money had not changed who she was, only what she could do for other people. She retired in 2024 not because she had to, but because she was 62 and had taught for 34 years and felt like it was time. She still writes her blog. It is no longer about divorce. It is about something harder to define, about friendship and grief and the ways that people show up for each other when it matters. About being seen. The blog has over 200,000 regular readers now. Margaret does not monetize it. She writes because people write to her and tell her that the words help. That is enough. She was asked once, in an interview that was published in the Sunday magazine section of the New York Times, whether she had ever been angry at Victoria, whether she had ever felt that the friendship, however genuine it became, was in some way built on a foundation of guilt. Margaret's answer has become one of the most quoted passages from the entire story. She said that she had asked herself that question many times, that she had examined it carefully, and that what she had arrived at, after considerable reflection, was this. Victoria Harrington had not come to her out of guilt. She had come to her because she had recognized something. She had seen, in the way Thomas talked about the woman he had left, in the careful construction of her absence, in the performance of indifference, the outline of someone worth knowing. And she had been right. And Margaret said that she chose to receive that recognition not as compensation for harm, but as a gift, from someone who had very little time and chose to spend some of it seeing her clearly. The interviewer asked if Margaret had forgiven Thomas. Margaret said no. She said forgiveness was not something she thought about, that what Thomas had done had reshaped her entire life in ways that could not be undone, but that she had moved forward, that she had built something meaningful from the wreckage, and that was better than forgiveness. The interviewer asked if Margaret thought Thomas deserved what happened to him. Margaret paused for a long time. Then she said that she did not think in terms of deserving, that life was not a ledger where good and bad got balanced, but that Thomas had made choices, small choices that seemed insignificant at the time, but that accumulated into something larger. The choice to stop seeing her, the choice to value appearance over substance, the choice to believe that more was always better, and that those choices had consequences, not because the universe was fair, but because Victoria Harrington had been paying attention and had decided that the person who deserved protection was not the person reaching for more. It was the person who had been quietly holding everything together all along. Margaret was also asked, in that same interview, what she would say to Victoria if she could speak to her one more time. Margaret smiled, a sad smile that carried years of friendship and loss. She said she would say thank you, not for the money, but for seeing her, for taking the time to look past the surface and see who she actually was, for building a friendship that had been real even though it was hidden, for showing her that being truly seen by another person, even once, even in the most unlikely circumstances, was the rarest and most valuable thing in the world. The interviewer asked if Margaret missed Victoria. Margaret said yes. Every day, she said that she wore one of Victoria's bracelets, a simple silver cuff that Victoria had worn constantly and that had been left to Margaret along with everything else. She said she wore it to remember, not the money or the will or the legal battle, but the cafe in New Haven, the conversations that lasted hours, the friendship that nobody knew about, the gift of being seen. This story raises questions that do not have clean answers. Was what Victoria did right? She entered a marriage knowing it was built on the wreckage of another woman's life, even if her intentions were ultimately protective. Was Margaret right to accept the inheritance? To build a relationship in secret with the woman who had, however unwillingly, participated in the destruction of her marriage? Was Thomas Collins simply a man who made bad choices? Or something worse? These are not questions this story answers. These are questions it asks you to sit with, because they are questions about all of us, about the choices we make when we believe no one is watching, about the people we overlook in our rush towards something that looks like more, about the kind of love that does not announce itself but simply shows up consistently and quietly and asks nothing back. Before we close, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Victoria made the right decision? Do you think the friendship between Margaret and Victoria was genuine? And the question that has generated more debate than any other. If you were Thomas Collins, sitting in that conference room, hearing a name you did not expect, what would you have felt? Not what you would have done. What would you have felt? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to know. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life who see you and the people who look past you, share it. Not to talk about money or divorce, but to talk about what it means to know another person. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Every week, we bring you stories like this. Stories about real people and real choices and real consequences. Hit that button. And next week, we are covering something that starts with a lottery ticket and ends with a secret nobody saw coming. You do not want to miss it. To everyone watching, remember this. Being seen, truly seen, even once, is everything.